Yeah, I don't know why you're clapping. You haven't heard me yet. I mean, I'd wait and even at the end, you're not to clap. Listen, fantastic to be here and really glad to be invited. And thank you very much for having me and thank you for your time. So I was indeed the Deputy National Security Advisor and oversaw the National Cybersecurity Programme and the money for the Offensive Cyber Programme. And I have a background in national security prior to that. But I always say to people, if people are telling you, if your speaker is telling you stories from, pre-COVID, 2018, he's probably out of date. And the thing that keeps me fresh are three things like this, events like this, but also I work for a firm called Brunswick Group, who are a communications and crisis response group for major corporates, and so we find ourselves helping a whole range of clients through major technology events, misconfigurations, product difficulties and recalls, ransomware attacks, DDoS attacks on occasion, which means I see what a lived successful attack is like and what the factors are and the way in which it impacts the leadership in a business and becomes an operational as opposed to a technical issue. And then the other one is, and I'm not going to advertise it here because we haven't sponsored today, but I'm a co-founder of several technology companies which work on security, in particular around encryption, it's got to be said. But that keeps me fresh and close. And I think it's always worth asking the question of, who is this speaking to me and why? Now, what I want to do today, though, is to draw on what a securocrat would say about the context within which we're having this discussion. Okay, and one of the things that shapes my approach is that I used to oversee national crisis response. So for UK folk in the room, the Cobra used to work for me, and when Prime Minister Cameron or May didn't chair the Cobra, I chaired it. So I chaired it for WannaCry, I chaired it for NotPetya, I chaired it, I chaired it. I dealt with crisis in doing that. And so one of the rules was I had to be dispassionate. And if I came in with a problem to the Prime Minister's office, I had to say what we'd do about it, no matter what it was. I wasn't allowed to say, this is really difficult and scary, and then walk away. But what it meant was we got very used to talking about really bad things utterly dispassionately, and then thinking what we do about it. And I think that behooves us, people in the room, to have that kind of mindset. Not to do the, big scare, gosh, there are state use of DDoS can do X or Y to you, but really understand, okay, it might do X or Y to you. What am I doing about it? What's the risk calculation I'm making? Does everyone understand the risk calculation I'm making? Am I happy with it? Do I want to test it? What do I want to do? So that's kind of my mindset. Now, in preparation for this event, I had the chance to talk with British and in particular American outgoing from the Biden administration leaders who've been leading on cyber. I thought it was interesting, and there was a kind of consistent theme, which is that defense in the cyber domain is becoming more, not less complicated, even though its profile is lower, given the scale of events. Yeah? So it's hard to quantify what scale of extortion attacks, ransomware or DDoS extortion are happening and which of them are backed by states. And there does seem to be a bit of a downtick in ransomware, but that's a bit of a downtick from a very high level. It's still of concern. And I was with the Biden cyber people last week who talked to me about there being 80 states of concern active in the cyber domain. 80 states. So in this country, we tend to talk about Russia, where the Russian language criminals tend to be after us. Yeah? And we tend to talk about China and the state threat, and then Iran and North Korea get thrown in because we've suffered in the past. But if there are 80 states active in the domain using and developing tools, that's quite a significant context within which to be operating in a problem. And there are certainly, and you all have done this with your kind of Google threat groups and the like, you'll have had a look, there are certainly 150 APTs nominated by various threat analysts, at least. Now, it's worth remembering that there are currently multiple hybrid wars going on in cyberspace. Yeah? I mean, clearly there is one between Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the West, and you've got that very interesting phenomenon that the United States has said that it's not going to talk about what it's doing vis-a-vis Russia. It seems to me that's what it said, and also that it's, in order to put pressure on Ukraine, wasn't going to mount offensive operations in support of Ukraine. And you guys are professionals in this field. You will understand that what they're talking about is those fantastic operations, largely directed by the Department of Justice and the FBI, that have been knocking Russian presence off internet infrastructure to create botnets. That's what that means. It means no more knocking them off the firewalls they were weaponizing to mount the kind of attacks that we're talking about today. So a suppressor in the state area apparently is gone, although we don't know the detail. And I can't confirm to you how much of it's gone and has it completely gone, or is it just they're not talking about it, or has it been reinstated because Zelensky's come to the table? But there's a very direct link between our humdrum day-to-day lives and what's going on in that space. The other thing to note is my title was Intelligence, Security and Resilience. And I had to have a plan for whatever, flood, strike, space weather. I love space weather. It's great fun. Can I give a talk on space weather instead? It's much more interesting. Okay. And the thing about resilience is that because of the heightened geopolitical uncertainty, nation states are increasingly concerned about resilience, and that has been heightened, of course, by the pandemic. So the awareness of multi-sector resilience being a requirement of national security is much more powerful today than it was in 2019. So, we all understand the food sector, we understand the health sector, yeah? We understand the university sector and the research sector and its ability to generate vaccines. Quite interesting, isn't it? This end of the 5-year period. And that's driving, and Cameron, I'm not going to put you on the spot, wherever you are, from the FCA, but that's driving regulatory behaviour, yeah? Because tolerance of operational difficulty is not high. And we've seen that, I think, in the case of the finance sector, where there's been a challenge in the UK saying it's not acceptable to have multiple outages because you've had misconfigurations or other operational difficulties. Not acceptable, and it's going to become a focus of regulatory and possibly fines, pressure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Going to affect your banking license. So resilience is a key thing to have in mind, not just the lived experience of being attacked and the number of attacks there are, the expectation of society. Now, as I say, I used to look after the money for the British Offensive Cyber Programme, so I kind of think about state programmes and I kind of understand what they are. Yeah, and I always kind of say to them that there's kind of 3 lockers, The top locker is those cyber tools that represent an act of war. So you're going to go to war and you're going to have quasi-kinetic effect, make things go bang or stop working as if they'd been bombed, yeah? And you're going to do something very obviously that is action by your state, yeah? And when we think of those various typhoons, Salt Typhoon and the rest of it, Chinese pre-positioning on a network, it may be pre-positioning for intelligence gathering, but it may also be pre-positioning in order to have quasi-kinetic effect, and itself is an intervention in international law. So that's top bucket, right? Which is hard to use because it's a very political thing to do. It's like sending your special forces to have a wander around someone's country. Not a thing you do. You've then got a middle bracket, which is deniable, but is identifiable. So we'll attribute it to an APT, but we deliberately don't say the APT is this state. We'll say we think it is, because it isn't the same. And then you've got really available and deniable tools. And in that bucket sits DDoS, because DDoS is such a widely used criminal technique that you can make use of it. And it's a joy because you can make use of it and people just say, oh, well, that's the cyber weather. That stuff happens. And you can insert into it state-level techniques and use it in combination with your middle bucket and potentially also, obviously, your top bucket, as we've seen with Russia attacking Ukraine. So it's important to recognise the range in which DDoS can be used, even though our lived experience of it is there's some pretty shonky criminal use of it, which doesn't overcome the technologies we have available and the approaches we have available to defend ourselves, or doesn't overcome it to an unacceptable level. Now, I went round all of the senior CISOs I know to have, not all, but some, to have a chat about today and say, where are you on this? Of the major banks in the City of London, a couple I spoke to, major airlines, had a chat, major providers to SMEs, I had a chat. Yeah, and they all said, we feel really comfortable, we've got Cloudflare, whatever, and this is not a priority for us at the moment. We deal with this all the time. We're confident in our team, we're confident in our partners. Great, super. And of course, I don't want to use the word complacency, but of course, that's a perfectly reasonable risk judgment. In my work with Brunswick Group, though, and I know it's true of many in the room here who provide services to a range of businesses, I come across a whole set of businesses, some of whom simply don't have that maturity. They're actually taking an unquantified risk. Yeah? They don't really think of themselves as a technology company. Right? I'll give you one example, which I've mentioned to a couple of people. A particular client is a provider of holiday camps where you can go and camp or use a trailer or stay in a chalet. Great. And so it's a physical thing. They have lots of physical things and they have to sell it, and they sell it online. And if no one buys it through their online thing, they're not a business. But they don't think of themselves as being a technology business. And so when they're hit by a extortion using DDoS, their mindset is not one where they say, okay, we're going to reconfigure, restructure, do it differently, and they didn't have the preparation in place and were almost destroyed as a business. And they're quite a large business, FTSE listed. So I think it's really interesting, that range in the kind of complacency bucket. Now, I think my senior CISOs are right, in that they've got great partners, including some of the presenters here today, and they've got strong defences. And then, DDoS, frankly, for them is more of a nuisance than a fundamental catastrophe. And also, frankly, they've got quite good service providers and ISPs with whom they have quite profound partnerships who are kind of absorbing quite a lot of the risk. I think where maybe they are overconfident, though, is that DDoS tactics are evolving beyond the traditional volumetric attacks and significantly beyond some of the layered attacks that we've seen. Yeah? And at the end of this, I'm just going to touch on the four principal actors that the National Cybersecurity Centre talks about in the UK and just say, what are they doing and why? And then I'm sure as we go through, we'll pick up on some of the techniques. But we're seeing many more application layer levels, combined attacks, and indeed API attacks as well. We're seeing that very interesting use, and I was talking to our guest today from Tech Mahindra about this just now, the very interesting use of artificial intelligence, or possibly machine learning, but I doubt it very much, to optimize the attack once it is initially rebutted. And a constant re-optimization of your DDoS approach once you've decided you're going after a particular target. And that is quite tricky, because all of us know that whilst we may have strong defenses, if you said we are perfectly defended and every aspect of our attack service is optimized and couldn't be better, and if you do an API attack, our partners and supply chain, all of their services are optimized too and are not going to be triggered to flood data back in response to the attack, we all know that isn't the case. So it's quite an interesting thing that's going on with that AI application. And then, of course, we've got this phenomenon of DDoS just being noise designed to distract you, or an injection technique. Particularly, I think, and I'll come on to Chinese attacks, particularly when you look at Chinese attacks, absolutely it is about doing something in combination with a fuller range of things that you want to achieve for an intelligence or war-fighting purpose. Finally, in this particular aspect, the way in which criminal services continue to be marketed and denial of service attacks, DDoS attacks, are available as a service. Well, we know that, like ransomware attacks are, and we all know when we come up against, well, I know anyway, when you come up against a ransomware group, you can immediately feel whether you're dealing with some people who are kind of doing it for the first time or are not doing it at industrial scale, and those who are absolutely at the top of their game. Yeah. Well, I think the same is increasingly true in RDoS attacks. That there is RDoS as a service being provided. And as we saw from Europol yesterday in their announcement, there's an increasing evidence of an interaction, in particular between Russia and criminal groups, to encourage them to use ever more effective techniques. Not with the objective of knocking things over, but just of causing chronic effect so that our societies don't work as well as they should. Our healthcare system, our finance system, our energy system, very deliberately getting back at the elements of Russian society that have been attacked. So then just to wrap up this particular sector, I'm really keen to chat to you in the break and really keen to hear what colleagues have to say in the next presentations and not wanting to overrun. Let's just break down the four principal actors: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea that the National Cyber Security Center seems to talk about. So Russia is trying to have hybrid warfare effect. So it's trying to cause operational failure, yeah, and to cause loss of confidence and loss of morale and loss of confidence. In the case of Ukraine, we saw a massive set, and we continue to see, not always successful, a massive set of DDoS attacks from Killnet, who seem to be kind of the lead Russian body doing this. And these were application layer attacks, very focused, and they've hit critical infrastructure in this country and in other NATO countries, but not at the scale they did it in Ukraine. And they are using botnets and AI-driven traffic manipulation to really maximize the effect they're able to have. And frankly, they're learning as they go. So they're not just repeating the same attacks, but that bottom locker I talked about, they're learning and changing that as they go. And digital government service, financial services, emergency response systems are kind of classic target set for them. They want to have societal effect. And for instance, the attack on NHS systems in 2022 here, and some API attacks in 2023, again in the same kind of target set. China are doing what is classically called adaptive and targeted DDoS. Okay, so they're doing traffic manipulation, and they're reflection attacks, and they're doing code insertion wherever they can. Yeah, and it's really, really noticeable that there is an aspiration in the Chinese system which mirrors that you would get from the National Security Agency or GCHQ, not just to think of immediate effect, but to think of how in the medium and long term we're going to be positioned, postured, have access, and be able to act in the way that our political masters direct. Yeah, so very consistently, Chinese like to leave behind added value, as my friends at GCHQ used to call it, on every occasion they get anywhere in a network. So that a Chinese DDoS attack is a really interesting challenge. And there's that great thing called the Great Cannon. I mean, the Chinese are great at names, really. It's fantastic. Anyway, the Great Cannon, which injects malicious scripts into internet traffic to redirect large-scale attacks. So it's quite sophisticated compared to, let's say, the Russian or the other attacks I'm going to talk about. And we could talk some more about China. About 5 or 6 times a year, I find myself working for a commercial client who these are major corporations who come to me and they're subject to a significant APT attack for a state purpose. So they're not ransomware groups and the rest trying to make some money, but they're actually subject to an attack because they have IP, because there's pursuit of a particular individual and intelligence needs to be gathered by the hostile state or whatever it is. And this is classic Chinese kind of behavior. So North Korea, we're all familiar with the Lazarus Group. They've been made very public. And North Korea are a classic, let's see if we can distract you while we steal some data or the ability to take some money over here. And that kind of DDoS as distractor as well as RDoS attacks if they can. It's just classic North Korea and pretty straightforward. But they don't stop and they learn as they go. And then Iran. Iran's really interesting because Iran is in one of those conflicts. You know, Iran is toe-to-toe with Israel and the West, but with Israel really, and has been. Anyone who says, you know, Iran and Israel aren't at war, the answer is they are, just in cyberspace, at sea, and, you know, as we've seen through the proxy groups. Yeah, and they're absolutely focused on CNI and on heavy-duty CNI, so the energy sector, yeah, and the communications and the transport sector. And it's really striking what you see in the Gulf states and with Israel in terms of the techniques that Iran use, and they're using kind of multi-vector DDoS attacks, trying to create kind of infrastructure disruption and demonstrate effect. And of course we've seen them over the years, and they've learned, haven't they, because 13, 14 years ago, in response to sanctions, they had to go with large DDoS attacks at American banks, which in part drove the market that is represented here today, I'd note. You know, the market of services represented in this room, driven in part by that nature of DDoS attack then. But since then they've learned that kind of thing just doesn't work, and they're a bit bored of losing. So they're becoming more effective and sophisticated in what they do. So if I had to draw out what are the themes to look at today, I think AI-driven attacks are at the cutting edge of it and need more thought. And we aren't yet at the stage of agentic DDoS attack, I don't think. I mean, you guys tell me if you've seen it, but I don't think we are. That certainly isn't what people are talking about. You need evidence that that was the case. But that can't be very far away, given the agentic revolution that's going on across the industry, you know, which we're seeing and which you hear from Silicon Valley. Multi-vector campaigns, you know, so unless you've got every single attack vector covered and know what you do on it, you probably aren't covered. And you need to optimize that. And you also, when you're talking about targeted API and application, but particularly targeted API, you're heavily dependent upon what's behind your interface with the provider that's then rendering to you the data. So that's really interesting. And I wonder the point at which that will become a question that DORA regulators will ask, because that must be a question you ask. Once we see a disruption of that kind, they'll come and ask that question. Anyway, that's me. I look forward to talking in the break, and I hope I've given you a sufficient overview of the world within which we're operating, which we need to have in mind when we calculate our risks. Thank you very much. Okay, good.